Supreme Court Judge Amara Hayes settled into her first-class seat, exhaling as the faint hum of the cabin wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. To anyone else, this might have felt like a luxurious escape from the world below. But for Amara, it was just another routine flight, a short reprieve between back-to-back court hearings and relentless hours spent reading case files. Still, there was something about being 30,000 feet in the air that offered a rare moment of clarity. Up here, life felt suspended, problems somehow shrinking as the clouds drifted by. She glanced down at her sleek, fitted dress, a birthday gift from her best friend Maria, who had laughed. "Girl, people need to know what a Supreme Court judge looks like these days." Amara had laughed with her, but knew the truth behind Maria's words. Despite the titles and accolades, despite the years she devoted to earning her seat on the bench, moments like these, a first-class seat, an expensive dress, still made some people look twice, as if she didn't belong. The hum of the engines grew as passengers filed down the narrow aisle, their voices blending into the rhythm of first-class travel. She watched with quiet amusement as a businessman in a wrinkled suit wrestled with his oversized carry-on, muttering under his breath, while a young mother, a few rows ahead, tried to soothe her crying toddler. Here, Amara could be anonymous, blending into the calm flow of strangers, all in their own bubbles, all just passing through, or so she thought. Her attention returned to the tablet in her lap, where she had been reviewing the details of a case, a small-town community fighting against a powerful corporation's waste disposal practices. The cause resonated deeply with her, and as she skimmed through the legal jargon, she could feel the familiar pulse of purpose grounding her in this tiny seat. She leaned back, letting the words become her focus, the rest of the world fading into the background. But then, something pulled her out of her concentration, a feeling more than anything else. She looked up, her gaze catching the eye of a flight attendant moving down the aisle. The woman's face was carefully blank, the kind of look trained for efficiency. Yet Amara felt an unmistakable chill in her expression, a hesitation that lingered just a beat too long. As the woman's eyes drifted from Amara's face to her dress, then to her seat number, attention settled over Amara, subtle but sharp, like the feeling of stepping into a too-cold room. She tried to brush it off. After all, she'd been through this enough times to know how to choose her battles. But something about the woman's stare left a faint bitterness in her mouth, one that no amount of composure could entirely swallow. Amara turned back to her case files, but her mind wouldn't settle. She knew the look too well, the one that said, "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" The same look she'd seen 1,000 times. Whether it was entering a courtroom or dining in a high-end restaurant, it was the unspoken challenge, the silent insistence that she justify her presence. The plane began to taxi, and Amara took a deep breath, willing herself to let it go. She had more important things to focus on than a flight attendant's lingering glance. But even as the plane lifted off and the world below faded to a quilt of colors, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that this journey might be different, that perhaps this moment wasn't meant to pass as easily as the clouds outside her window. The sun began to set, casting the cabin in warm hues of orange and pink. As Amara watched the colors blend through the small window, she felt a calm wash over her, momentarily stilling her restless thoughts. She had fought harder battles in much fiercer arenas. She could handle a flight. This was just another test, a reminder of the resolve she'd built through years of navigating spaces where people like her were rarely expected, much less welcomed. She closed her eyes, letting the rumble of the engines lull her back to her work. Yet, somewhere deep inside, she knew the challenge that lay ahead wasn't just about a case or a flight, but something far more personal. And whether she wanted it or not, she could feel the tug of that familiar, relentless question: what would you do to defend your dignity, even when the world insists you shouldn't have to? Amara hadn't intended to look up again. Her focus was fixed on the complex details of her case file. But a prickling awareness tugged at her, that instinct honed from years in the courtroom, an ability to sense when she was being watched. She looked up, her eyes meeting the same flight attendant, who was now standing a few rows down, gazing at her with a look that was anything but professional. The woman approached with a polished smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved with practiced grace, but Amara sensed the tension behind her movements. "Good evening," the flight attendant said, her voice cool as she began to collect drink orders. Amara felt a slight tightening in her chest. She knew this exchange, had played it out countless times in different settings. There was a kind of coded language in encounters like these, one that rarely needed words to convey a message. She was an expert in reading people, a skill she perfected over years on the bench. The flight attendant's body language was saying something unspoken, something uncomfortable. As Carol, the name on her badge read, approached her row, Amara straightened slightly, keeping her expression neutral. The attendant's gaze drifted pointedly from Amara's face to her dress, then back up to her seat number, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle that simply didn't fit. Carol's voice softened, carrying a thinly veiled edge, as she leaned closer to Amara. "Your dress," she said with a faint hint of surprise. "It's very striking. Must have been expensive." Her eyes lingered on the intricate beading along the neckline, a detail that Maria had gushed over when she'd given it to Amara just last month. Amara felt the slight barb hidden in the compliment, the subtle suggestion that someone like her couldn't afford such luxury. She took a deep breath, keeping her voice steady. "Thank you," she replied calmly, meeting Carol's gaze. It was a gift. The response was simple, but Amara felt the familiar sting that accompanied these moments, a sting she had been conditioned to bear with grace, but never with acceptance. Carol's eyes flickered with something cold, something that told Amara this interaction was far from over. The flight attendant straightened, her plastic smile tightening. "I'll need to see your boarding pass again. Just a routine check," she added with a slight shrug, her tone falsely casual. Amara's stomach clenched. She'd flown this airline countless times, and she knew that no one else around her had been asked for a routine check. But years of navigating spaces like these had taught her not to react immediately. She moved deliberately, reaching into her purse and pulling out her boarding pass, holding it out with a calm, steady hand. Carol took it, her fingers barely grazing the edge as though the very paper might tarnish her. She inspected it with exaggerated care. Her eyes narrowed as she read the details. Her gaze lingered on the bolded words at the bottom. Government rate. Amara watched as Carol's lips twisted slightly, a frown forming as if she were trying to process what she was seeing. Government rate, she muttered, her tone sharp. "And what exactly do you do for the government?" The question hung heavy in the air, an implication buried beneath the words. It was clear that Carol didn't believe Amara belonged here, and each word seemed to challenge her right to occupy this seat. Amara felt a familiar heat rise within her, a mixture of anger and exhaustion. It was one thing to deal with people's silent assumptions, but it was another to be outright questioned about her right to exist in a space. Yet, she chose her words carefully, each syllable measured. "I work in the judicial system," she said quietly, letting the weight of her experience carry through in her voice. Carol's eyebrows arched in barely concealed skepticism. "Well, everything seems to be in order," she said finally, her voice laced with disbelief. She handed back the boarding pass with a reluctance that was almost comical, as though she half expected it to vanish from her hand. A businessman across the aisle glanced up from his laptop, his brow furrowing as he caught the uncomfortable exchange. Amara could feel other passengers turning slightly, their curiosity piqued, and for a moment, a bubble of tension settled around her row. Carol straightened, her gaze dropping back to the dress once more. And for a fleeting second, a flicker of something darker crossed her face, resentment, perhaps, or a warped kind of disdain. "You know," she said, her voice soft but sharp, "first class has certain standards. Not everyone understands that." It was a subtle, cutting statement, each word falling like a stone between them. Amara felt her pulse quicken, the heat of suppressed anger simmering beneath her composed exterior. She had dealt with this kind of treatment before, but something about the confinement of the plane, the proximity of strangers, made it feel sharper, more visceral. She looked Carol in the eye, her own gaze unwavering. "I assure you," she said, her voice even. "I am well aware of the standards." The flight attendant hesitated, visibly thrown by Amara's unshaken composure. Amara could sense the eyes of other passengers on them, quiet witnesses to the tension unfolding in first class. For a fleeting moment, Carol's confidence wavered, but she quickly adjusted her grip on her cart and forced a stiff, almost mechanical smile. "Very well," she murmured, moving on down the aisle, her eyes darting away from Amara's as though she were unwilling to see the strength of the person she had tried to diminish. As Carol disappeared into the back of the cabin, Amara turned back to her tablet, pretending to focus on the legal text that no longer held her attention. She took a steadying breath, her hands clenching slightly as she tried to shake off the tension from the encounter. But the words on her screen blurred as memories stirred. Moments from her past when she'd faced this same subtle battle. This quiet insistence from others that she'd justify her presence. Outside her window, the sky had shifted to deep shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm light across the cabin. Amara looked out, letting the colors soothe her. A reminder of the calm she'd fought hard to cultivate over years of encounters like this. Yet, somewhere deep down, she felt a stirring, a reminder that there were some battles she could no longer ignore. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Amara tried to return her attention to the case files in her lap, but her mind was unsettled, each word on the screen slipping past her focus like grains of sand. The plane hummed around her, a soft rhythm that usually calmed her nerves. Yet today it felt sharper, an edge to every small sound. She reminded herself of her own rule: keep calm, stay focused. But something about this felt harder than usual. The smell of dinner service drifted through the cabin, a reminder of her intended plans for this flight. A quick meal, a dive into case notes, and perhaps a few hours of rest. But now, that felt like a distant hope. As she reached for the water on her tray, she noticed Carol making her way back up the aisle, her eyes scanning the rows with a hard-edged determination that seemed to find its mark on Amara. Carol approached her seat, pushing the dinner service cart with a practiced hand. Yet there was something forced in her movements. Her polished smile had tightened into a mere sliver of professionalism, the kind that hid disdain behind a mask of courtesy. "Your dinner choice?" Carol asked, her tone sharp, a trace of impatience woven into the words. Amara kept her face composed. "I'll have the chicken, please." As Carol set the tray down on Amara's table, her movements were just a fraction too abrupt. The water glass teetered precariously, its contents sloshing dangerously close to the edge, and Amara instinctively moved to steady it. Carol didn't flinch, her eyes fixed on the delicate beadwork around Amara's neckline. She tilted her head, a hint of derision barely concealed. "That's quite a dress," she said, her voice low but unmistakably pointed. "Must have cost a pretty penny." The insinuation hung heavy between them, cutting through the composed air of the first-class cabin. Amara could feel the weight of each word, the unspoken assumption that her presence and her attire somehow didn't belong in this space. Years of practice kept her expression neutral, though inside, her frustration simmered. "It was a gift," Amara replied, her voice steady and polite. She knew she didn't owe Carol an explanation, but experience had taught her that sometimes the simplest response was the most disarming. Carol's brows lifted slightly, as if the response had only confirmed whatever assumptions she had drawn. She hesitated, tapping her fingers on the edge of the cart. "How nice for you," she murmured, her words dripping with skepticism. Amara let the words pass, choosing silence over conflict. But then, without warning, Carol's voice sharpened, the casual indifference replaced by a pointed demand. "I'll need to see your boarding pass again. Just a routine check." Amara felt her pulse quicken, the request landing like a blow. She had flown enough times to know this wasn't standard protocol, and the singling out was clear as day. Her hand moved deliberately to her purse, pulling out the boarding pass with a calm that belied her irritation. She handed it to Carol, meeting her eyes with a level gaze that spoke of patience. A patience she had honed through countless unspoken challenges like these. Carol took the pass between her fingertips, inspecting it with a slow, exaggerated thoroughness that seemed designed to provoke. Her eyes lingered on the booking details. The government rate printed clearly at the bottom. A shadow of confusion crossed her face, quickly masked by a smirk. "Government rate," she muttered, not bothering to hide her disbelief. "What exactly do you do for the government?" Amara held her gaze, refusing to give in to the mounting frustration. She knew this game all too well, knew the implications behind Carol's tone. The question wasn't curiosity, it was a challenge. A demand that she justify herself in a space Carol thought she had no right to occupy. "I work in the judicial system," Amara replied, each word carefully measured. Her tone was calm, but her voice carried the authority she had earned over years of relentless work. Carol raised an eyebrow, the disbelief clear in her expression. She handed back the boarding pass, her fingers dropping it with obvious reluctance, as though she found a discrepancy that justified her behavior. "Well, everything seems to be in order," she said. Her voice clipped. A subtle tension had settled over the cabin, the quiet murmurs of other passengers dimming as curious glances flickered in their direction. Amara could sense them watching, the bubble of first class pierced by this strange, uncomfortable exchange. A businessman across the aisle paused mid-typing on his laptop, his gaze darting between Amara and Carol, a look of faint disapproval crossing his face. Carol took a breath, her mouth set in a thin line, and Amara felt the resentment radiating from her. She glanced back at the dress, her lips pressed into a faint sneer. "First class has certain standards," she said softly, a barely disguised accusation woven into her words. The comment was so brazen, so direct, that for a second, Amara found herself speechless. She had been through countless incidents of implicit bias, subtle jabs that forced her to confront prejudice in measured ways. But rarely had she encountered something so blatant, so shamelessly spoken in a confined space where every pair of eyes was on her. She straightened in her seat, her eyes meeting Carol's with a calm, unyielding gaze. "I assure you," she said quietly, each word clear and deliberate, "I understand the standards very well." For a moment, Carol faltered, as if she hadn't anticipated the quiet power in Amara's response. Her eyes shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, and Amara sensed the delicate balance of authority shifting. Carol's fingers tightened around the card handle, her shoulders stiffening as she forced a brittle smile. "Enjoy your meal," she muttered, before abruptly turning and moving down the aisle, her back straight, but the confidence in her steps visibly shaken. Amara exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders unwinding as she watched Carol disappear toward the back of the cabin. She knew that even now, as the flight continued on its steady path across the sky, this was far from over. Amara barely touched her meal, each bite feeling heavy under the weight of what had just unfolded. Carol's words, her dismissive glances, and the way she had practically demanded that Amara justify her presence. It all lingered, a bitter taste that refused to fade. Amara had learned early in her career to master the art of composure, to maintain her dignity even when others tried to strip it away. But something about this encounter felt different, sharper, as if her patience were being stretched to its breaking point. As she pushed her meal tray aside, Amara caught the eye of the elderly woman across the aisle. The woman gave her a sympathetic nod, her eyes filled with an understanding that needed no words. It was a small moment of solidarity, but it reminded Amara of the countless women before her who had faced this same battle in various forms. Sometimes, a simple nod of empathy could be as powerful as any spoken word. She tried to return to her case files, flipping through the pages of the environmental lawsuit she'd been analyzing. But the words blurred before her eyes. Her thoughts spun back to Carol's cold stare, her thinly veiled contempt. Amara knew prejudice was woven deep into the fabric of the world. She had fought it in courtrooms, dismantling it with precision. Yet here, on this plane, it felt like an unwanted reminder of how far society still had to go. And then, just as she tried to settle herself, Carol returned. The flight attendant moved down the aisle, collecting trays with a briskness that felt almost forced. Her eyes flitted from passenger to passenger, barely lingering until she reached Amara. Without a word, Carol reached across her to collect the tray, her body leaning so close that it brushed against Amara's shoulder. It was subtle, a small, almost imperceptible press of her weight, but Amara knew it was no accident. She'd been around enough hostile glances, enough condescending touches, to recognize the message behind the gesture. You don't belong here. Amara's grip tightened around her tablet. She wanted to ignore it, to brush it off as another minor offense. But a voice deep within her rebelled. She thought of her mother's words, spoken to her as a young girl. They can only make you feel small if you let them. Her gaze sharpened as she looked up at Carol, who was now straightening up with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Is there something I can help you with? Amara asked, her tone steady but unmistakably firm. It was a voice she reserved for the courtroom, one that left no room for disrespect. Carol hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the question. Just making sure everything is in order, she replied, her voice saccharine yet brittle. Her gaze dropped again to Amara's dress, lingering for a beat too long, a thinly veiled sneer tugging at her mouth. Amara felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her face composed. Thank you, she replied, her words laced with the same steely politeness she used in court. I assure you, everything is exactly as it should be. Carol's eyes narrowed, her forced smile wavering as she realized she'd lost whatever small victory she thought she'd won. The businessman next to Amara had stopped pretending not to listen, his brow furrowed as he took in the exchange. Across the aisle, the elderly woman watched with quiet outrage, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Carol looked as though she wanted to say something more, her fingers twitching slightly on the card handle, but she seemed to think better of it, turning away and muttering under her breath. First class has standards. After all, Amara's hand froze mid-page, her patience thinning to a thread. The weight of Carol's words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. She'd been through moments like this too many times to let it pass. She thought of her law school days, when professors had doubted her capabilities, of the courtrooms where she'd been mistaken for someone's assistant, and of the glances she still received even in her Supreme Court robes. Enough was enough. She closed her case file, her movements deliberate as she looked up, her gaze finding Carol with a calm intensity that was impossible to ignore. I think, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. You and I should be very clear about something. Carol turned, her face paling slightly under Amara's unblinking stare. The cabin seemed to hush, a silence settling as nearby passengers tuned in, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Amara stood up slowly, her height putting her eye to eye with Carol. There was no anger in her stance, no aggression, just a steady, dignified presence that commanded attention. I am Justice Amara Hayes, she said, each word measured, of the Supreme Court. The effect was immediate. Carol's face went white, her eyes widening as she processed what she'd just heard. A ripple of recognition moved through the nearby passengers, a murmur of surprise spreading in the air. The businessman beside Amara shifted, his face breaking into a small, approving nod. The elderly woman across the aisle sat up straighter, her expression one of pride. Amara held Carol's gaze, her tone unwavering. This dress was a gift from a dear friend, and my ticket was booked through official government channels. But even if that were not the case, I, like every other passenger on this plane, am entitled to be treated with respect. Carol stammered, her bravado crumbling in the face of Amara's authority. I didn't know, she managed, her voice small, almost pleading. I had no idea. Amara's gaze softened, though her voice remained firm. That's exactly the problem, she said quietly. You didn't know who I was, and yet you felt comfortable making assumptions about me. A young woman a few rows ahead raised her phone, nodding with conviction. I recorded everything, she said, her voice clear and steady. People need to see this. Carol looked around, panic flashing in her eyes as the reality of her actions sank in. She took a small step back, her shoulders slumping under the weight of collective disapproval. At that moment, Sarah, the younger flight attendant with a warm smile, appeared at Carol's side. "I'll take it from here," she said firmly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. Gently, she guided Carol back toward the galley, casting a supportive glance at Amara. Amara sat back down, feeling the eyes of the passengers around her, some offering nods of encouragement, others with quiet murmurs of admiration. The elderly woman reached across the aisle, placing a gentle hand on Amara's arm. "Well done," she whispered, her voice filled with genuine respect. "That was long overdue." Amara nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips as she allowed herself a small moment of victory. She glanced out the window, watching the sun dip below the clouds, casting the sky in warm, fading hues. She had won this battle, not just for herself, but for the countless others who fought quiet wars in spaces that were meant to welcome them, but so often didn't. As the plane continued its journey across the sky, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose settle within her. She had fought for dignity and justice in courtrooms, in boardrooms, and now, here, in a first-class cabin, against the prejudice that still lingered in the everyday world. And with every small stand, every quiet triumph, she knew she was paving the way for others to do the same. The cabin buzzed with a quiet intensity in the aftermath of the confrontation. Amara could feel the energy shift, a strange mixture of admiration, discomfort, and silent approval floating in the air. She settled back in her seat, exhaling slowly, her fingers unclenching from where they had gripped her case files. She had held her ground, faced down Carol's prejudice without raising her voice or losing her dignity. But she knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. Across the aisle, the elderly woman leaned over once more, her eyes warm with understanding. "You've shown us all something tonight, dear," she murmured. "I've seen people stand up before, but rarely with such grace." Amara offered her a small, grateful smile, but her thoughts were already drifting. She couldn't help but think of all the times she had witnessed prejudice in her life, from whispered insults to open hostility, and how, despite her position and the authority she held, she still wasn't immune to the sting of discrimination. It was exhausting, this constant need to prove her worth, even in the face of baseless judgment. The businessman beside her shifted in his seat, his brow furrowed as if deep in thought. "I've traveled a lot," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he had just realized something uncomfortable. "But I've never really thought about what others might be experiencing in the same space." He paused, looking genuinely contrite. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." Amara nodded, sensing the sincerity in his words. "Sometimes it's hard to know when to speak," she said, offering a gentle reminder. "But your support, even in silence, made a difference." Just then, Sarah, the young flight attendant who had guided Carol away, approached her row, a genuine expression of regret on her face. "Justice Hayes," she began softly, leaning down so only Amara and a few nearby passengers could hear. "On behalf of the airline, I want to sincerely apologize for what happened. This is not the standard we uphold, and we'll be taking immediate action to address it." Amara could see the honesty in Sarah's eyes, a raw determination to make amends not out of obligation, but out of a true desire to set things right. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady but warm. "I hope this can be an opportunity for growth, not just for her, but for your whole team." Sarah nodded, gratitude evident in her gaze, before retreating to the front of the cabin, where she spoke briefly with the lead flight attendant. Amara glanced around, noticing that a few passengers continued to look her way, some nodding subtly in support. The young woman who had recorded the incident caught her eye and mouthed, "Are you okay?" Amara returned a small nod, touched by the concern from strangers who had, for a brief moment, shared in her experience. As the cabin lights dimmed, Amara tried to refocus on her work, but the incident weighed heavily on her thoughts. She considered all the young black women who faced similar situations, who were treated with suspicion simply for existing in spaces where others assumed they didn't belong. She thought of her niece, just starting her own journey in law school, and how much work still lay ahead for her generation. It was a long flight, and by the time they began their descent, Amara felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and renewal. She knew that when she stepped off this plane, she would return to her courtroom, her title, her role as an agent of justice. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this small, confined encounter was as crucial as any case she'd ever ruled on. It was a reminder that justice didn't just live in courtrooms or in legal documents. It was built and defended in everyday interactions, in the moments when people made choices about how they treated one another. As the seatbelt sign dinged and passengers began to prepare for landing, Carol appeared once more at the front of the cabin, her face pale, her eyes darting between passengers with a hollow, haunted look. She was visibly shaken, and Amara saw the toll her actions had taken. When Carol reached Amara's row, she stopped, her mouth opening and closing as if struggling to find the right words. "Justice Hayes," Carol whispered, her voice barely audible. She hesitated, swallowing hard before continuing. I don't know what to say." The cabin went still, every nearby passenger pretending not to listen but clearly tuning in. Carol's eyes were wide. Her posture shrunk, her confidence stripped away. She looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way that made Amara see her not as an adversary, but as someone facing the weight of their own actions for perhaps the first time. Amara took a breath, her gaze steady and thoughtful. She had presided over enough cases to know when an apology was genuine and when it was simply a bid for forgiveness. But this moment wasn't about Carol alone. It was about something bigger, something rooted in the very fabric of society. "Sometimes," Amara said gently, "our actions reveal more than words ever could. Today, your actions spoke about assumptions that not only harm individuals but shape the world we all share." Carol's shoulders slumped further, and she blinked, a tear slipping down her cheek. I never saw myself as—" Her voice cracked, unable to finish. The elderly woman across the aisle leaned forward, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "Prejudice has a way of hiding in places we don't expect," she said softly, as if offering both a comfort and a reminder. Carol looked at Amara, her gaze full of shame, and whispered, "I'm truly sorry." Amara held her gaze, feeling the weight of all the battles she'd fought in her career, all the moments when people had underestimated her, doubted her, dismissed her. She knew that one apology wouldn't erase the harm, but perhaps it could plant a seed of change. "Use this as a chance to reflect," Amara replied, her tone firm but compassionate. "Learn from this. Change doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from understanding, from recognizing the impact of our actions." Carol nodded, her face wet with silent tears, before she turned and made her way toward the back of the plane. The businessman beside Amara reached out, his voice barely a whisper. "You're an inspiration," he said. "Thank you for the lesson you just gave all of us." As the plane touched down, the familiar jolt of landing sent a ripple of anticipation through the cabin. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, grounding herself in the feeling of solid earth beneath her. This flight was just one of many she'd taken in her life, but it had left a mark she wouldn't soon forget. As passengers began to gather their belongings, the young woman with the phone approached her, still holding the video she'd taken of the incident. "Do you want me to delete it?" she asked, her voice strong but respectful. Amara smiled, touched by the gesture. "Keep it," she said, "but use it wisely. Sometimes, we need to see ourselves through others' eyes to understand the full impact of our actions." The woman nodded, a spark of understanding in her eyes, before stepping back to let Amara collect her things. As she exited the plane, the airline manager waited by the gate, his face full of professional concern. Behind him stood Carol, looking down, her hands clasped tightly. The manager began to speak, but Amara held up a hand. "I don't want just an apology," she said, her tone steady. "I want action, diversity training, sensitivity awareness, not as punishment, but as a path toward growth." The manager nodded, visibly taken aback, but respectful. Carol glanced up, her expression a blend of remorse and newfound understanding. Amara could see the rawness in her eyes, the beginning of a transformation she hoped would take root. As she stepped into the bustling terminal, Amara felt a sense of purpose settle within her. The world was full of spaces where justice was needed, sometimes in the most unexpected corners. This encounter had reminded her that her work wasn't just confined to a courtroom. It was a living, breathing thing, unfolding in every interaction, every choice to stand up for dignity. Walking through the airport, Amara felt a renewed sense of duty, a reminder that justice was an ongoing commitment. She had made a difference today, and perhaps, in some way, had sparked a change that would ripple beyond this flight. The journey toward equality was long, but each stand, each choice to address prejudice, was a step forward, and she, Justice Amara Hayes, was ready to keep walking. As Amara stepped out of the jet bridge and into the bustling terminal, the sharp contrast between the quiet tension of the plane and the busy airport felt jarring. She inhaled deeply, grounding herself. It was as if the air, free from the constraints of the plane, reminded her of the steady foundation she had spent a lifetime building. She was a Supreme Court justice, a voice for justice in society, but moments like these reminded her that dignity, respect, and fairness weren't just abstract principles. They were lived, and sometimes painfully tested, experiences. As she collected herself, Amara caught sight of Sarah, the young, kind-hearted flight attendant, waiting by the gate alongside a man in a sharp suit, the airline's manager. His face a mask of concern and professional contrition. A few paces behind him, Carol stood slightly off to the side, her gaze trained on the ground, shoulders slumped in defeat. The manager extended his hand as Amara approached, his face a practiced blend of professionalism and remorse. Justice Hayes, I want to personally apologize on behalf of the airline for the unacceptable experience you endured on our flight, he began, his voice carefully measured. This is not a reflection of our company's values, and I assure you that we are committed to addressing this incident. Amara nodded but kept her expression steady, sensing that he expected her to simply accept his apology and move on. Thank you for your words, she replied, her voice calm yet resolute. But words alone aren't enough. I believe your airline can take real, meaningful steps to prevent this from happening again. The manager blinked, caught off guard, but quickly recovered. Of course, we take these matters very seriously and will be implementing core. Amara looked him directly in the eye. This isn't just about one person's mistake. Prejudice, even when subtle, impacts the lives of people every day. I want to see comprehensive diversity and sensitivity training for your entire team, not just as a formality, but as an opportunity for real change. The weight of her words lingered, and the manager's professional composure softened, his face shifting from corporate routine to genuine reflection. You're right, he admitted, a slight tremor in his voice. We need to do better. I promise we will take this seriously. Behind him, Carol's posture shifted, and she finally looked up, her face marked by shame and a fragile vulnerability. Justice Hayes, she murmured, her voice faint yet laced with sincerity. I know an apology can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that I've learned something today. Truly. Amara studied Carol, sensing the genuine remorse behind her words. She knew from years of judging character that change didn't come from a momentary pang of guilt. It grew from a deeper understanding, a recognition of harm done, and a commitment to act differently in the future. Amara nodded, her tone gentle but firm, acknowledging it as a start. Carol, but real change is something you'll have to choose every day, in every interaction. It's a commitment to see beyond assumptions, to treat everyone with respect, regardless of title, appearance, or background. Carol swallowed hard, a flash of understanding and gratitude in her eyes. I understand, she whispered, her voice unsteady. And I'm truly sorry. Amara gave a small nod. Thank you for saying that. I hope this experience leads to growth, not just for you, but for everyone who witnessed it. As she turned to leave, she felt a gentle touch on her arm. It was the young woman from the flight, the one who had recorded the incident. She held her phone carefully, her expression a mixture of conviction and respect. "I wanted to share this with you," she said softly, offering the video, "not to stir trouble, but because I believe people need to see how these things happen, how they build up in small moments until they're impossible to ignore." Amara accepted the phone with a thoughtful nod, grateful for the young woman's awareness. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "You're right. Sometimes, seeing ourselves through others' eyes is the only way to truly understand the harm we can cause, even without meaning to." The young woman's eyes glimmered with determination. "Thank you for standing up today. You reminded all of us that dignity is worth defending." As Amara made her way through the terminal, her thoughts lingered on what had transpired, and the weight of her experience began to settle into something deeper. Today's encounter was more than a personal affront. It was a reminder that injustice, however small or seemingly insignificant, left scars. It wasn't just about winning in courtrooms or delivering rulings from the bench. Justice was a daily, lived reality, one that required vigilance, courage, and resilience in the face of prejudice. The airport lights blurred around her as she walked, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. Her mind raced with thoughts of her next speaking engagement, a law school commencement where she'd been invited to share her journey. She now knew exactly what she'd say. She'd tell the young graduates that justice wasn't confined to legal documents and grand decisions. It thrived or died in the smallest of encounters, in the spaces where ordinary people chose to act or to stay silent. When she finally reached her car, Amara slid into the familiar leather seat, her mind already turning over the events of the day. She opened her phone, her fingers hovering over the Notes app as she began typing her thoughts for her upcoming speech. Justice isn't just a concept or a title, it's a responsibility. It means standing firm in the face of prejudice, in defending dignity, not only for yourself, but for others. And sometimes, it means making the choice to teach rather than punish, to guide rather than condemn. As the city lights blurred past her window on the drive home, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose settle within her. This encounter would stay with her, a quiet reminder of the work that lay ahead, not just for her, but for all those who believed in a world where dignity and respect were given freely, not grudgingly. The city lights blurred through the window as Amara's car sped down the highway. The hum of traffic a steady, calming rhythm that allowed her mind to drift. She felt the weight of the day settle over her, a familiar mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. But more than anything, there was a renewed fire inside her, a sense of purpose that had grown brighter in the face of adversity. Today's experience had reminded her of something she'd nearly forgotten: that justice wasn't just a role, a title, or even a courtroom. It was a living, breathing choice she made every day. When she arrived home, the quiet comfort of her house felt grounding. She set her briefcase by the door, paused for a moment to take off her shoes, and walked into the living room. The walls, lined with law books, awards, and photographs of family and friends, reminded her of her journey, the battles she'd fought and won, the obstacles she'd overcome, and the legacy she was building. Her thoughts returned to Carol, the flight attendant, and that moment of shared humanity at the gate. Amara hoped that the seeds of change had been planted, that Carol would carry that day's experience forward and use it as a foundation for growth. But she knew that personal change, while powerful, was only part of the solution. True progress demanded systemic change, a broader understanding that could reshape minds and policies. Amara took out her phone and scrolled through her calendar, her eyes landing on an event that had once felt routine: a speaking engagement at a local law school. She'd planned to give a polished, prepared speech about her journey to the bench, the cases that had defined her career, and the mechanics of the legal system. But now, she knew she needed to tell a different story, one rooted in the reality of prejudice, privilege, and the power of small moments. With a renewed sense of clarity, she opened her Notes app and began typing, the words coming easily, as if they'd been waiting beneath the surface all along. Underscore 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 underscore. The next week, when she stood at the podium in the law school auditorium, the room was packed with eager faces, a blend of nerves and ambition that reminded her of her own days in law school. She could feel the anticipation in the air, every eye fixed on her, waiting for insight, inspiration. She glanced at her prepared remarks, a carefully structured speech about the legal profession, but decided to set it aside. Today, she would speak from the heart, from a place of truth. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady yet warm. "I could stand here and tell you about the landmark cases I've ruled on, or the challenges I faced to reach this position. But I think there's something more important I need to share with you." The room hushed, every student leaning in, their attention unwavering. "Last week," she continued, "I was on a flight, just an ordinary trip, and I experienced an interaction that reminded me of why I pursued justice in the first place." She recounted the incident on the plane, the subtle glances, the blatant bias, the quiet power of choosing to stand firm against prejudice. She spoke of Carol, her expressions carefully measured to focus not on judgment, but on the need for understanding and change. Her words flowed, each one resonating with the students, a tangible lesson about dignity, courage, and the importance of standing up, not just in courtrooms, but in life. "I've sat on the bench for years," she said, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "And I've read the cases, seen the evidence, and handed down rulings. But let me tell you something. Justice doesn't always start in a courtroom. It begins in the small, quiet moments when someone chooses to do what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it means standing up against assumptions and prejudice." A young woman in the front row raised her hand, her face earnest. "Justice Hayes, how do you keep going when it feels like nothing changes?" Amara smiled, recognizing the familiar doubt. "Because even when progress seems slow, every act of dignity and courage leaves a mark. Today, you have the power to redefine what justice looks like. It's not just a profession, it's a way of life. Carry it with you into every interaction, every conversation. Change happens one person at a time, one moment at a time." As she finished, the students erupted into applause. Amara looked out at the crowd, her heart full, her conviction deepened by the young faces looking back at her, each of them a part of the next wave of change. Underscore 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 underscore. That night, as she returned home, Amara felt lighter, a quiet sense of accomplishment settling over her. She knew the fight for justice was ongoing, a battle that demanded resilience and courage. But she also knew she wasn't alone in it. There were others like the young woman on the plane, the students in that auditorium, who were ready to carry the torch forward. Sitting in her living room, she gazed at the city lights through her window, her thoughts lingering on the journey that lay ahead. She was reminded that justice wasn't about a single victory. It was a continuous commitment to uphold dignity, respect, and fairness in every moment, every encounter. And as she drifted into sleep, she felt a quiet, enduring strength settle within her, a strength rooted in knowing that she, Justice Amara Hayes, would continue to stand for what was right, every day, in every way. A week after her speech at the law school, Amara sat in her chambers, the quiet hum of the courthouse filling the air around her. She was deep in thought, reviewing documents for an upcoming case. But her mind kept drifting back to that fateful flight, the young woman with the recording, and the questions from the law students. The experiences had left a subtle but profound mark on her, a reminder that justice, at its core, wasn't just a duty to be fulfilled, but a light to be carried forward. Every courtroom, every decision, was a step in the long path toward equality. But even more than that, it was about making the choice, every day, to stand up in both small and significant ways. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts, and her assistant stepped in, holding an envelope. "This just arrived for you," she said, setting it gently on Amara's desk. Amara opened it carefully, her gaze falling on a letter written in neat, careful handwriting. The first few words stopped her mid-breath. "Justice Hayes, I am writing to thank you for opening my eyes." It was a letter from Carol, the flight attendant. She spoke of reflection, of the difficult but necessary journey she'd started. Acknowledging the harm her actions had caused, she admitted to the prejudices she had carried without even realizing it and shared her commitment to challenging her own biases. At the bottom of the letter, Carol had scrawled a line that caught Amara's eye. "Because of you, I've begun to see the world through a new lens." Amara folded the letter, a quiet warmth filling her. The impact of that one encounter had extended far beyond a single apology or a single flight. It was a reminder that change, while sometimes invisible, could ripple outward, reaching places she'd never imagined. As she gazed out of her office window at the city below, she thought of all the people she'd encountered in her life's journey, the supporters and the skeptics, the friends and the challengers, and those who would carry the torch of justice forward. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that her actions were more than individual moments. They were part of a collective legacy, woven into the lives she'd touched along the way. A sudden knock broke her reverie, and her clerk entered with a fresh stack of case files. The weight of the papers reminded her of her duty, her calling. She took them with a steady hand, a sense of clarity settling over her. As Amara prepared for the next case, she knew that each decision she made, each moment she spent pursuing justice, was part of something greater, a commitment to make the world better, one act of dignity at a time. And she knew, with unwavering certainty, that this was the legacy she was meant to leave. Looking out once more at the bustling life below, she felt the quiet, unbreakable resolve of a woman who had found her purpose, not just in the law, but in life itself. And with that, Justice Amara Hayes returned to her work, carrying forward the light of justice that would continue to inspire others long after her time on the bench.